My name is Paige Tanner, and I was 34 years old when I learned that a hospital bed is the only place where people finally tell you what they really think, because they assume you can't get up and walk away. I had been lying there for 6 days, with 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung that was still draining through a tube in my side, and a cast that ran from my knuckles to my elbow on my right arm, the one I used to hold my daughter when I nursed her. Nora was 6 weeks old when I drove home from the late shift at the clinic, and a truck ran the red light on K-Fax, and I woke up to a ceiling that looked like it had been stained by a decade of other people's pain. My mother walked in at 11 in the morning, which I knew because I had been watching the clock like it was the only thing in the room that still made sense. She set her purse on the rolling tray table, the one I wasn't supposed to use for anything heavy because it buckled on one side, and she said, "Your sister just got a promotion." Regional director? Oh, she's 32 and she's already running an entire division. She did not ask how my lung was doing. She did not ask if I had been able to hold Nora yet, or if the physical therapist had come by, or if I had eaten anything that morning that didn't taste like the inside of a plastic cup. I was the one who had been useful. I had been useful since I was 12, when my father lost his job at the plant, and my mother sat me down at the kitchen table and explained that my sister was gifted. My sister needed the set prep classes and the new piano teacher and the tutors who charged $120 an hour, and I was the one who understood that sometimes you have to sacrifice for family. That was the first time I heard the phrase, the one she would use for the next 22 years, the one she pulled out whenever she needed me to take less, so my sister could have more. "You always understand," she said. And what she meant was that I would always take the hit, and I would never complain, and I would never make her feel bad about it, because being the one who understood was my job, my role, my entire place in the family machine. Visual, hospital room, Eiffel pole, plastic cup of water, clock on the wall. When I was 14, my sister got a car for her 16th birthday, a red Honda Civic with a spoiler on the back that my father spent a month cleaning in the driveway. I got a bus pass and a part-time job at the dry cleaners on 5th, where I folded shirts for $4.75 an hour, and came home smelling like chemical solvents that gave me headaches I never told anyone about. My sister drove herself to her piano lessons and her sat prep and her friends' houses on the nice side of town. I took the 7:15 bus to school and the 4:30 bus to work and the 9:45 bus home, and when I got there I would find my mother in the view with a glass of wine, and she would say, "Your sister's having a hard time with her practice test scores. She's so stressed. I just don't know what to do with her." She never asked about my headaches. She never asked if my shift had been long. Yalka. But she did say, "You always understand." And I did. I understood that I was the one who absorbed the pressure, so my sister could float above it. And that was the entire architecture of our family, built on a foundation of me being fine, so everyone else could be not fine in ways that actually counted. I moved out at 18, the week after I graduated high school, because my mother had called me into her office, which was really the dining room table covered in bills and sticky notes, and she had told me that my sister needed the bedroom I was using because she was applying to colleges that required a quiet space for her interviews. I said, "Where am I supposed to sleep?" And my mother said, "You always understand. We'll figure something out. Maybe the basement." The basement had a concrete floor and a furnace that cycled on every 37 minutes, and a smell of damp that never fully dried out. I moved into a studio apartment above a laundromat, and I took the job at the nursing home that would end up paying for my certifications and my community college credits and eventually my license to practice as an RN at the clinic on contract. I did not ask for help. I did not get any. My sister went to a private university on the coast, and my parents sent her $1,000 a month for rent. And I worked 12-hour nights and studied in the break room on my phone and scraped together enough to pay for my tuition, one class at a time. Visual, studio apartment, laundry machines below, textbooks on a milk crate. The arrangement began when I was 22, the year my sister graduated and announced she was getting married to a man who worked in commercial real estate and wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent. My mother called me at work the night shift, 3 a.m, and she said, "Your sister needs a credit guarantor for the wedding venue. The caterer. The florist. They won't let her put it all on her own name, because she doesn't have the credit history yet. She's just out of school. And you have the stable job. You have the consistency. You always understand." I said yes, because I had never said no, because I had been trained since I was 12 to say yes, because the phrase was already so baked into my bones that I didn't even hear it as a question anymore. I heard it as a fact of nature, like gravity or the bus schedule. I co-signed for $12,000, and then for another $8,000, and then for the rehearsal dinner, and then for the honeymoon suite, and then for the photographer, and then for the extra floral arrangements that my sister had added at the last minute, because she wanted the imported roses from Ecuador. I did not attend the wedding because I had to work, but I sent a card with a check for $300 that I had saved over 2 months. And my mother called me the next week and said the check had bounced and I need to cover the overdraft fee. And I said, "I'll take care of it." And she said, "You always understand." She said it again when my sister had her first child, a boy, and my mother announced that she would be moving 3 states away to be close to the baby, which meant she could not help me with Nora when my daughter arrived 2 years later. She said, "You always understand. You're so independent. You've always been the one who can handle things on your own." My sister got 6 months of her help, and I got nothing, and I never said a word about it because the word had already been written for me, and I was too tired to rewrite it. I worked the night shift at the clinic, 4 nights on, 3 off, and I raised Nora in the mornings after I got home, when I would hold her against my chest and feel her breathing, and I would think that at least she would never hear that phrase from me. At least she would never be asked to understand something that was really just a demand to disappear. My sister sent me a text once a month, usually at night, usually with a photo of her house or her husband's car or her son in a Halloween costume that cost $200. And she would say, "You're so lucky you get to just work and go home. No pressure, no expectations." She never asked how I was doing. She never asked what it felt like to work 12-hour shifts with a 4-hour sleep window and a baby who needed feeding in the middle of it. She didn't have to. I always understood. Visual, night shift nurse's station, phone lighting up with a photo from her sister. The mechanism was a credit card. It was just a credit card, the one I had co-signed for my sister's wedding expenses, the one I had put in my name because she couldn't qualify on her own. I had never used it. I had never even held it in my hand. But I was the primary account holder, and she was the authorized user, and that arrangement had been in place for 12 years, without anyone in my family ever looking at the terms. I had been the one paying the minimums when she forgot, which was often. I had been the one absorbing the late fees and the interest charges, and the occasional over-limit penalty that she never mentioned, the one who kept the account afloat so her credit score would stay pristine while mine hovered somewhere around fair to middling. I never told her. I never told anyone. I just logged into the portal every month, checked the balance, transferred whatever I could from my checking account, and told myself it was fine. It was what I did. It was what I had always done. The card had a clause, a thing in the fine print that I had read exactly once, years ago, when I was bored during a slow shift and scrolling through the paperwork on my phone. If the primary account holder was not the one using the card, and if the authorized user had made more than a certain number of transactions in a rolling 12-month period, the primary holder had the right to terminate the authorized user's access without notice. It was a consumer protection thing. It was designed to prevent credit fraud, to stop people from using someone else's name to build a debt they couldn't pay back. I had read it and thought, that's interesting, and then I had closed the app and forgotten about it for almost a decade. I did not think about the clause again until I was in the hospital bed, 6 days after the accident, watching my mother on FaceTime with my sister, while my sister held up the cake she had just baked for some party I had not been invited to, a party that was happening in my house, in the house I had bought 2 years ago with the money I had saved from the night shifts, and the overtime and the careful budgeting I had done while I saved from the... My mother turned the phone toward me, and my sister waved, and she said, "Oh my God, Paige, you look terrible. You really need to take better care of yourself." And then my mother pulled the phone back and said, "You always understand. She's just worried about you." I watched her, a woman who had never once asked me how I was doing in 34 years of being my mother, and I realized that I had been paying for my sister's life for 12 years, 12 years of co-signed loans and gifted checks and minimum payments made on her behalf. 12 years of being useful, but never being worth the effort of a single genuine question. The exact balance on the credit card was $38,472. I had been paying the minimums for 12 years, and the interest had never stopped accruing, and the balance had never gone down because my sister kept using it, kept putting her vacations and her groceries and her kids' school supplies on a card that carried my name. I had never told her to stop. I had never told anyone. And then I was lying in a hospital bed with a tube in my lung and a cast on my arm and a clock that had been ticking for 6 days, and I opened the credit card app on my phone and read the clause again. Visual, phone screen with fine print highlighted, the credit card balance visible. The escalation started with my sister's text messages, which I had been receiving on a loop for the past year. Always the same question, always the same tone. "Can you cover this month's payment? We had an unexpected expense with the kitchen remodel. The kids' school fees are due, and I forgot to budget for them. Can you just transfer a little extra this time? I'll pay you back next month." She never paid me back. She had never paid me back. But I always said yes, because that was what I did. That was what I was for. That was the machine I had been built into. And then my mother had called me on day 4 of my hospital stay, when I could barely breathe, without the tube scraping something in my chest, and she had said, "Your sister needs a new car. Her old one is falling apart and the kids need something reliable. Can you co-sign for her? You always understand." I said, "I'm in the hospital." My mother said, "I know, but it's just a signature. The dealership can email you the paperwork." I said, I have a punctured lung. My mother said you always understand. It's not for her, it's for the kids. You want the kids to be safe, don't you? I had not cried since the accident. No. I had not cried when they told me my lung had collapsed, or when they had put in the chest tube, or when I had woken up from the surgery to set my arm. I had not cried when Nora's father had shown up at the hospital and looked at me like I was a problem he had to solve instead of a person he had to love. I had not cried when my mother had spent the entire visit talking about my sister's promotion. But I cried then in that hospital bed, with the phone pressed to my ear and the tube in my chest, and the cast on my arm. And I cried because I realized that she had never seen me as anything other than a tool. She had never seen my pain, because my pain was not useful. My pain was not something she could use to make my sister's life easier. I wiped my eyes with the back of my good hand, and I said, I'll have to get back to you on that. And my mother said, you always understand, and I said, I do. And I hung up the phone and I opened the credit card app and I started reading. Visual, hospital bed, phone in one hand, the other hand in a cast, the IV pole beside her. The mid-story hook is that I had already started the process 2 days before I knew how it would end. I had filled out the forms, the ones that would terminate my sister's authorized user status, but I had not submitted them. I had saved them in a folder on my phone, and I had looked at them every morning when I woke up, and every morning I had said to myself, not yet. I was waiting for something. I did not know what it was until the day my mother called me and told me that my sister was hosting a party at my house. The house I had bought with my own money, the house that my parents had never visited and my sister had never stepped foot in, the house that I had been paying the mortgage on for 2 years while they were all living in a version of reality where I was nothing more than a service provider. My mother had not asked if she could use the house. She had not asked if I was going to be there, or if I was okay with people tracking mud through my living room, or if I had any objection to my sister's friends taking photos in my backyard. She had just said, your sister is hosting a party for her husband's colleagues at your place because you have that nice yard and you always understand. I had not responded. I had let the silence sit there for a full 10 seconds, and then she had said, hello? Did you hear me? And I had said, I heard you. And then I had hung up and opened the forms on my phone and hit submit. The party was 2 weeks later. I had been discharged from the hospital by then, but I was still wearing the sling for my arm and the wrap for my ribs and the occasional oxygen tube when the lung got tight. I drove to the house at 6 in the evening, when the party was supposed to be in full swing, and I parked across the street and watched my sister's friends pull up in SUVs and sedans, and I watched my sister greet them at the door I had installed myself because the old one had been drafty, and I had not wanted to pay a contractor. She stood there in a dress that looked like it had been tailored for her, and she hugged people and laughed and pointed toward the backyard where I could see the string lights I had strung up last summer. The lights I had bought because I wanted Nora to have a nice place to play, and I watched my sister take credit for all of it. Visual. House across the street, string lights in the backyard, people gathered. I waited until everyone had arrived. I waited until the caterers were setting out the food and the wine was flowing, and the music was loud enough that no one could hear a doorbell over it. And then I walked across the street, opened the front door, and stepped into my own house for the first time in 3 weeks. My sister saw me first. She was standing in the kitchen, talking to a woman I did not recognize, a woman who wore a blazer and expensive earrings, and who looked like she was used to being in charge. My sister's face went through 6 emotions in 3 seconds, starting with confusion and ending with something that looked like panic. She said, "Paige, you're here." And I said, "It's my house." And my sister laughed high and bright and wrong, and she said, "We're just using the space. You always understand." And yeah, now the name calling. How caution. The callback phrase was delivered publicly. She said it in front of the woman in the blazer. The woman who I would later learn was her husband's boss, a regional director at the commercial real estate firm that had been courting my sister's husband for a partnership. She said it like it was a joke, like I was the funny sister who always showed up at the wrong time, like I was the one who didn't get it. She said, "You always understand. You're so easygoing." And the woman in the blazer looked at me, and I could see her calculating, trying to figure out which one of us was the real threat. I pulled out my phone. I opened the credit card app. I turned the screen toward my sister, and I said, in a level voice, "I have terminated your authorized user status. The credit card in your name is no longer active. The account is now solely in my name, and you are no longer permitted to use it." My sister's face went white. She said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "The card you've been using for 12 years. The one I co-signed for. The one you've been running up with your groceries and your vacations and your kitchen remodel. I terminated your access effective this morning." She said, "You can't do that." And I said, "I can. It's in the terms." "You never read them." And I even did. I block only calm, no. You. My mother appeared from the backyard, still holding a glass of wine, her hair perfectly done, her lipstick freshly reapplied. She saw my sister's face, and then she saw me, and she said, "What's going on?" My sister said, "She's cutting off my credit card." And my mother said, "Paige, don't be ridiculous. You always understand. This is a party. You're making a scene." And now, Nate. The receipt was a spreadsheet. I had been working on it for 5 days, sitting in my apartment with my laptop propped on a pillow on my lap, because I could not sit upright for more than an hour at a time. It listed every transaction my sister had made on the card for the past 12 years. Every dollar, every date, every category. It was 41 pages long. I had printed it at the copy shop down the street, and I had brought it with me in a folder that I held against my chest with my sling. I set the folder on the kitchen counter, and I opened it, and I spread the pages out in front of my mother and my sister and the woman in the blazer. Visual: kitchen counter, 41 pages of spreadsheets, credit card balances highlighted. I said, "This is every charge she made on the card from January 2014 to this morning. 17,000 in restaurant charges. 22 penny odd, 22 soda, 14,000 in furniture and home goods. 9,000 in groceries, which doesn't sound like a lot until you realize I was paying for it while I was feeding my daughter on a night shift budget." I looked at my mother and I said, "You told me I always understand. You told me that for 22 years. You told me that when I was 14 and I was riding the bus to my job while she drove to her piano lessons. You told me that when I was 18 and you put me in the basement. You told me that when I co-signed for her wedding and her car and her house and her life. You told me that 4 days after I got hit by a truck and I was lying in a hospital bed with a tube in my lung. You told me that because you knew I would take it. You knew I would never push back. You knew I would always be the one who understood, which is just a nicer way of saying you never had to see me. Aye. The woman in the blazer, whose name was Christina Ellsworth, picked up one of the pages and scanned it. She looked at my sister and then she looked at me, and she said, "This is the account that was supposed to be paid off by the end of last quarter." My sister's husband had used the credit card to pay for his firm's expenses he had been billing as company costs, but had actually been funneling through my sister's card to hide them from his partner. Christina Ellsworth was his boss. She was the one who had been evaluating him for the partnership. She had access to the firm's financial records, and she had been noticing discrepancies for months. The spreadsheet in front of her confirmed every suspicion. She looked at my sister's husband, who had just walked into the kitchen carrying a tray of appetizers, and she said, "We need to talk." And he looked at the pages on the counter, and he looked at his wife, and he realized that the story he had been telling for years had just collapsed in front of him. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I let them talk, and I let them argue, and I let the panic spread across their faces as they realized that the foundation they had built on my invisible labor was gone. Christina Ellsworth told my sister's husband that the partnership review would be indefinitely postponed. She told him that the firm would need to conduct an audit of the expenses he had been submitting. She said it in a tone that was bored, administrative, the tone of someone who had been doing this job for 20 years and had seen 100 men like him fall apart in her office. Visual. Christina Ellsworth reading the spreadsheet, the husband's face draining of color. My mother grabbed my arm. She said, "Paige, please, you can't just walk away. We're family." I looked at her hand on my sling, and I said, "I can." I said, "I have been walking away for 12 years. You just never noticed because you were too busy taking things from me." I pulled my arm free and I walked out of the kitchen, through my own living room, past the string lights I had hung for my daughter, and out the front door. The party kept going for another 20 minutes before the guests started to realize something was wrong. But I was already in my car by then, already driving back to my apartment, already feeling the shape of the quiet that was waiting for me. The quiet dismantling began the next morning. I did not call my mother. I did not answer her texts. I did not pick up the phone when my sister's number appeared on my screen, which it did 6 times before noon. I opened the credit card portal and closed the account entirely, not just the authorized user status, but the whole thing, the one I've been paying minimums on for 12 years. And I let the debt revert to the estate of the person who had incurred it. I took my name off the lease for my sister's apartment in the city, the one I had been co-signing for because she couldn't qualify on her own. I emailed the property manager and the utility companies and the insurance provider, and I removed my signature from every document I had ever put my name on for them. My sister called me the next week from a number I did not recognize. I answered because I thought it might be the hospital, and she said, "You ruined everything. He's leaving me. The firm is auditing him. I have no credit card, no access to any of the accounts. I have nothing." I said, "You have what you always have. You just don't have me anymore." She said, "You always understood. Why did you stop understanding?" And I said, "I didn't stop. I just realized there was nothing to understand." Oh. My father called me 2 weeks later. He had been silent through the whole thing, through the accident and the party and the collapse of his favorite daughter's life. He said, Your mother is distraught. And I said, Is she? And he said, She's been drinking. And I said, That's not my problem. And he said, Paige, you were always the strong one. You always understood. And I said, That's the fourth time you've said that exact phrase to me in 2 weeks. It hasn't meant what you think it means for a very long time. Visual. Phone screen. The caller ID showing a blocked number. The apartment kitchen sink. He sent me an email the next day. It was brief and it was awkward, and it was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging that he had let the whole thing happen. He said, I should have said something. I should have stopped her. I didn't know how much you were carrying. I did not respond. I left it in my inbox and I let it sit there, and I did not give it the weight of a reply, because a reply would have been a conversation, and I was done having conversations with people who had spent my entire life pretending I was invisible. The silent phone is my favorite part of the story. It is the part I did not know I was waiting for. The calls stopped after the 3rd week, not because they stopped trying, but because they ran out of things to take. My sister had no more credit to abuse. My mother had no more demands to make. Oh, my father had no more guilt to offload. They had been running a machine that ran on me, and I had stopped feeding it, and the machine had ground to a halt, and now they were sitting in the silence I had been living in for 34 years. I bought a table. It sounds small, but it was the first thing I'd bought for myself without thinking about whether someone else would need it. It was a walnut table, not too big, with 4 chairs that matched, and I put it in my new apartment, the one I moved into after I sold the house, because I did not want to live in a place where they had been, where they had used my space and my lights and my yard without ever seeing me. The table was for Nora, when she was old enough to sit in a chair, and for me, when I needed to eat a meal that did not taste like exhaustion. Visual. Walnut table, 4 chairs, a plate of food, a child's sippy cup. I sat at that table on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the party, and I ate dinner with Nora in her high chair, and I watched the sun go down through the window, and I realized that I had been holding my breath for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to exhale. My phone was on the counter, face down, and it was silent. It had been silent for 3 days. I had not checked it because I did not need to. There was no one left who was going to ask me to understand something I should never have had to understand in the first place. I looked at Nora, who was smearing mashed sweet potato across her tray, and I said, You are never going to hear that phrase from me. You are never going to be asked to be small, so someone else can be big. She did not understand me. She was 9 months old. But I said it anyway, because I had to say it to someone, and she was the only person in the world who would ever hear my voice without expecting me to disappear into their needs. My name is Paige Tanner. I was 34 years old when I stopped understanding. I am 34 years old now, and I am still learning what it means to take up space that no one is trying to take from me. The woman at the hospital, the one who had been my attending nurse on the last day of my stay, had asked me what I was going to do when I got out. She was not the kind of person who asked questions she didn't want answers to, so I told her the truth. I said, I'm going to go home and figure out who I am without them. And she had nodded, and she had said, That's a good plan. That's the only plan that matters. She was right. I did not know who I was without them when I walked out of that hospital. I did not know who I was when I terminated the credit card, or when I walked out of my own house, or when I sat alone in my apartment for the first time in my life with a phone that was not demanding anything from me. But I was learning. I was still learning. Visual. Apartment window, the sun going down, the high chair with a child. I think about the table a lot. I think about the 4 chairs around it, and how I bought them for myself, and how I will never have to decide whether someone else needs my seat more than I do. I think about the string lights in the backyard, the ones I left hanging because I could not bring myself to take them down. And I think about how they still glow at night, even though no one is watching them. Even though no one is watching them. Even though no one is using them to perform a version of my life that does not include me. They are just lights. They are just things I bought, and things I hung, and things that exist in the world, because I put them there. My sister sent me one last email, 3 weeks after the party. It was long, and it was rambling, and it was full of blame and guilt and confusion and grief. She said, "You were the only one who ever helped me. You were the only one I could count on. And now you're gone, and I don't understand why." I read it, and I put my phone down, and I did not reply. I understood why she didn't understand. She had never had to. She had never been the one absorbing the blow. She had never been the one whose pain was invisible, whose labor was unacknowledged, whose presence was only valuable insofar as it could be used to make someone else's life easier. She had been the one for whom the machine was built, and now the machine was gone, and she had no idea how to function without the mechanism that had run on my invisible fuel. My mother left a voicemail on the 4th week. She said, "Paige, please, we can work this out. We're family. You always understand." I listened to it, and I deleted it, and I did not call her back. The phrase had been used 4 times in the story of my life. The first time when I was 12, and I gave up my bedroom so my sister could have a quiet space to study. The second time, when I was 22, and I co-signed for her wedding, and she never paid me back. The third time, when I was in the hospital and my mother asked me to co-sign for a new car. The fourth time, when I was standing in my own kitchen, and I realized that the phrase was not a request. It was a command, and I did not have to obey it anymore. I am learning how to live without the noise. I am learning how to sit at my table and eat a meal and not wait for the phone to ring with another demand. I am learning how to see my daughter as a person and not a project, how to hold her without thinking about whether I am holding her the way I was held, which was not at all. She will never hear that phrase from me. She will never be asked to understand something that is really just a request to disappear. My name is Paige Tanner. I was 34 years old when I left my family behind. I am 34 years old now, and I'm sitting at my table, and my phone is silent, and I am finally learning how to breathe.